Tonight, we are going on a very long, very slow journey. Not to any one place, not to any single battle or forgotten kingdom. Tonight, we are traveling through time itself, drifting quietly through the entire span of human invention. From the very first stone shaped by trembling prehistoric hands, all the way to the glowing screen of the device you might be holding right now. 100 facts about the history of technology. 100 small, strange, wonderful moments when someone looked at the world and thought softly, gently, almost without meaning to, there must be a better way to do this. We are going to visit those moments one by one, without rushing, without noise. Each fact is a doorway into a quieter version of history. A history not of wars and kings, but of curious people in dusty workshops, in smoky caves, in candle-lit rooms full of half-finished machines. Pull your blanket up a little higher. Let your shoulders settle. We have a long, pleasant road ahead of us, and there is no hurry at all. Before we begin, I want to take a brief moment to say something from the heart. This channel, Heyo Boring History for Sleep, has been something I have been building quietly, carefully, for over a year now. More than a year of writing, recording, and putting these slow stories out into the world. And as of right now, we have right around 200 subscribers. That is a small number, and I will not pretend otherwise. But if you are here, listening to this, drifting off to the slow hum of history, you are exactly the kind of person this channel exists for. If these calm, unhurried stories help your mind settle at the end of a long day, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. It costs nothing, it takes 1 second, and it means more than you could possibly know to a small channel still finding its way. Tell me in the comments where you are listening from tonight and what time the clock reads on your wall. It is oddly comforting to know that somewhere across the world, someone else is drifting off to the same quiet march through the past. Now then, let us begin. Part 1. The very first tools: stone, bone, and fire. Imagine the oldest night you have ever seen. No cities, no roads, no light on the horizon except the cold silver of stars and the reluctant glow of a half-moon. The earth is enormous and silent and entirely indifferent to the small upright creatures picking their way across it. And yet, even here, even in this almost incomprehensible darkness at the beginning of human time, something remarkable is happening. Someone is making something. That is where our story begins. Fact 1. The oldest known stone tools in the world were discovered in Kenya at a site called Lomekwi 3. And they have been dated to approximately 3.3 million years ago. Let that number sit for a moment. 3,300,000 years. These are not tools made by humans as we understand the word. They were made by an earlier ancestor, possibly Kenyanthropus platyops, a species whose name most people have never heard, and whose face we can only guess at from fragmentary fossils. These tools, heavy, rough, bashed together with what archaeologists call percussion flaking, meaning one stone was used to strike another, are the oldest confirmed evidence we have that some creature on this earth looked at a rock and decided to reshape it on purpose. They are not elegant, they are not beautiful, but they are intentional. And that makes them everything. Fact 2. For the vast majority of human prehistory, the dominant tool technology was something called the Acheulean hand axe. These teardrop-shaped stone tools appear in the archaeological record around 1.8 million years ago, and remain largely unchanged for over 1 million years. 1 million years! To put that in perspective, modern humans have only existed for around 300,000 years. So there was an entire stretch of time, vastly longer than anything our species has existed for, during which the cutting-edge technology of the day was essentially the same teardrop of chipped stone. Archaeologists find them across Africa, Europe and Asia in enormous numbers, scattered across ancient lake beds and riverbeds like sleeping stones waiting to be noticed. They were used for butchering animals, for digging, for scraping. They fit in the palm of a hand and were held without a handle. They were the Swiss army knife of the ancient world, and they worked well enough to stay in use across an almost geological span of time. Fact 3. The controlled use of fire by human ancestors is one of the most transformative technological developments in the history of life on Earth, and it is also one of the most debated. The earliest solid evidence for controlled fire use comes from a site in South Africa called Wonderwork Cave, where burned bone and plant ash have been found in layers dating to around 1 million years ago. Some researchers believe Homo erectus, our predecessor, was using fire even earlier than this, perhaps 1.5 million years ago, but the evidence becomes more ambiguous the further back you look. What is not debated is the consequence. Fire changed everything. It extended the usable hours of the day. It provided warmth in cold climates, protection from predators, and, perhaps most significantly, it allowed cooking. Cooked food is more calorie-dense and easier to digest than raw food. Some researchers, including Harvard biologist Richard Wrangham, have argued that the ability to cook fundamentally altered the trajectory of human evolution, freeing up energy that the body no longer needed for digesting raw meat and redirecting it toward growing a larger brain. Fire, in this reading, did not just keep us warm, it made us smarter. Fact 4. Making fire on purpose, rather than simply maintaining a fire that had started naturally, required a second technological leap entirely. The most ancient fire-making tools we have found are bow drills and hand drills, in which a wooden spindle is rotated rapidly against a flat wooden board, generating enough friction to create a small ember in a nest of dry tinder. This technology appears across nearly every culture on Earth that existed before the widespread availability of metal and flint strikers. Archaeological sites in Africa, Europe and Asia have all yielded evidence of fire-making toolkits, small bundles of carefully selected woods, dry grasses and fungal material. The choice of wood mattered enormously. Different woods generate different amounts of heat through friction, and the practitioners of hand-drill fire-making had detailed empirical knowledge of which combinations worked best in their local environment. This was not guesswork. This was the slow accumulation of tested, transmitted knowledge. Technology, in other words, exactly as we understand it today. Fact 5. Around 90,000 years ago, at a site called Blombos Cave on the southern coast of South Africa, people were doing something extraordinarily unexpected. They were making paint. Ochre, a natural iron oxide mineral that ranges in colour from yellow to deep red, was being ground into powder, mixed with bone marrow and charcoal, and stored in abalone shells for later use. These are some of the oldest known examples of a prepared mixture, a manufactured substance rather than a raw natural material. Whether the ochre was used for body decoration, for marking objects, or for symbolic communication of some kind is not entirely certain. But what is certain is this. Someone was taking multiple ingredients, combining them deliberately into a new substance, and storing the result in a container. That is a recipe. That is chemistry. That is, in a very real sense, manufacturing. Fact 6. The bone tools of the Upper Paleolithic period, dating from roughly 50,000 to 10,000 years ago, represent a remarkable diversification of human technology. For most of prehistory, tools were made almost exclusively from stone. But in this later period, tool makers across Africa and Europe began working extensively in bone, ivory and antler, producing needles with eyes for sewing, harpoon tips with carved barbs, and decorative beads. The presence of sewing needles is especially significant. Needles mean sewn clothing. Sewn clothing means fitted garments that trap body heat far more effectively than simple draped hides. Sewn clothing may in fact be one of the reasons that modern humans were able to survive in the far northern environments of Europe and Asia during the last ice age, when temperatures across much of the continent were far colder than today. A tiny bone needle, barely the length of a finger, may have been as important to human survival in the Ice Age as any weapon or hunting tool. Fact 7. Around 15,000 years ago, in what is now southern France and northern Spain, human beings were painting the walls of caves with a sophistication and beauty that still stops people in their tracks when they see it today. The caves of Lascaux in France and Altamira in Spain contain images of horses, bison, deer, and aurochs rendered in ochre, charcoal, and manganese dioxide, with a naturalism that would not be matched in European art again for thousands of years. But these paintings were not just art, they were also technology. The painters used scaffolding, arrangements of poles lodged in crevices in the cave walls to reach the upper surfaces of caverns. They used hollow bones as blowpipes to spray paint in fine mists, creating soft gradients and atmospheric effects. They used the natural curves and bumps of the rock surface to give their animals a sense of three-dimensional form. This was controlled, deliberate, tool-assisted production. It was craft. Fact 8. The bow and arrow is one of the most significant weapon technologies in human history, and it is far older than most people assume. The earliest confirmed arrowheads have been found in South Africa and date to around 64,000 years ago. The bow operates on a principle that represented a genuinely new idea in physics: stored energy. By bending the bow and drawing the string back, the archer converts muscular effort into elastic potential energy held in the wood and string of the bow. When the string is released, that stored energy is transferred instantaneously to the arrow, which can travel far faster and with far more force than any projectile that could be thrown by hand. This was not incremental improvement on existing technology. This was a new concept entirely. The idea of a tool that could hold energy and release it on demand. It is the same conceptual foundation as a spring, a catapult, a compressed gas cylinder. The bow did not just change hunting, it changed the philosophy of how machines could work. Fact 9. One of the most underappreciated early technologies is rope. Twisted fibers for binding and carrying appear in the archaeological record at least 35,000 years ago, and some researchers believe plant fiber cordage is considerably older than that. The importance of rope is almost impossible to overstate. You cannot build a shelter without lashing poles together. You cannot make a composite tool, a stone blade hafted to a wooden handle, without binding them. You cannot make a bow without a bowstring. You cannot raft or sail without rigging. Rope is the connective tissue of almost every other technology that followed it, and yet it is almost never mentioned in the popular history of invention, because it is so ordinary, so ubiquitous, that we forget to notice it. The people who first twisted plant fibers or strips of animal hide into something strong and flexible enough to hold a load solved a problem that was foundational to the entire subsequent history of construction, transport, and manufacturing. Part 2. The wheel, the plough, and the rise of civilization. From the long, slow Stone Ages, we drift forward now, across enormous stretches of time, into a period of accelerating change. Agriculture has taken root. Villages have become towns. Towns are becoming cities. And the problems of civilization, how to move things, how to grow enough food, how to manage water, are driving an explosion of new ideas. We are in Mesopotamia now. The rivers are dark and slow. The air smells of river mud and baking grain. And someone, somewhere, is about to invent something that will change everything. Fact 10. The wheel is perhaps the single invention most commonly cited as humanity's greatest, and yet its origin story is both more complicated and more interesting than the simple version suggests. The earliest known wheels were not used for transportation at all. They were potter's wheels, rotating platforms used to shape clay vessels, and they appear in the archaeological record of Mesopotamia around 5,500 years ago. The transport wheel, the wheel attached to an axle and used to move loads, appears somewhat later, around 5,000 years ago, also in Mesopotamia, and possibly independently in the Eurasian steppe. This gap matters because it suggests that the wheel was not invented as a solution to the single obvious problem of rolling things around. It was invented in a different context entirely, and its application to transport came afterward. The idea had to migrate from pottery to carts, which is itself a kind of conceptual leap. Fact 11. Early wheeled vehicles were far more primitive than you might imagine. The first wheels were solid discs of wood, either carved from a single piece of timber or, more commonly, assembled from 3 planks and held together with wooden braces. They were heavy, they cracked easily, and they could only be used on relatively smooth, firm surfaces. The spoked wheel, which is lighter and more resilient, did not appear until around 2,000 years later, around 3,500 years ago, and its development is closely tied to the emergence of the chariot as a military vehicle in the ancient Near East. The spoked wheel required a level of precision woodworking that solid disc wheels did not, and its development likely depended on improvements in bronze tools capable of shaping the curved wooden spokes with sufficient accuracy. Lighter wheels meant faster chariots, and faster chariots changed warfare in ways that reverberated across centuries. Fact 12. The domestication of oxen and horses was not just an agricultural development, it was a power technology. For most of human prehistory, the only available source of mechanical energy was the human body itself. Domesticated draft animals changed this fundamentally. A single ox can pull a load that would require the effort of several strong men. A horse can travel faster and further. The combination of the wheel and the draft animal represented the first significant expansion of human mechanical power beyond what human muscle alone could provide. It was a form of outsourcing, finding a way to do work without doing the work yourself. That conceptual move, finding a way to redirect natural forces to do work on your behalf, is the conceptual foundation of every engine and motor that came after. Fact 13. The plough is another technology whose importance is almost impossible to overstate. Early agricultural communities used simple digging sticks to break the soil, which worked well enough in the soft, easily cultivated soils of river floodplains, but was inadequate for heavier soils. The ard, or scratch plough, appeared in the ancient Near East and Egypt around 5,000 years ago. It was pulled by oxen and consisted of a pointed wooden or stone tip dragged through the soil to create a furrow. This allowed the cultivation of land that was previously too hard to farm by hand, dramatically expanding the total acreage that could be planted. The later development of the heavy plough, with an iron ploughshare that could turn over dense, waterlogged soils, was critical to the agricultural colonization of northern and western Europe in the early medieval period. Heavy soils that had resisted cultivation for thousands of years were suddenly opened up to farming. The heavy plough quite literally made possible the civilization of medieval Europe. Fact 14. Mesopotamian irrigation represents one of the earliest and most ambitious feats of large-scale hydraulic engineering in human history. The great rivers of Mesopotamia, the Tigris and Euphrates, did not always flood at the right time for crops. They flooded in spring, when the snowmelt from the mountains in what is now Turkey sent water crashing down through the valleys. But the crops needed water in summer. And so the ancient inhabitants of this region built an elaborate system of canals, ditches, and water control structures that allowed them to store the spring floodwaters and distribute them across their fields through the summer growing season. These canals were not small undertakings. Some stretched for dozens of miles and required the coordinated labour of thousands of people to dig, maintain, and manage. They also required a sophisticated understanding of topography. The engineers had to understand how water moved, how gravity pulled it downhill, and how to route channels across the landscape so that water would flow in the right direction. This is hydrology. This is civil engineering, and it was happening 5,000 years ago. Fact 15. Writing was born from the needs of administration, not from any impulse toward literature or self-expression. The earliest known writing system, cuneiform, developed in Sumer in southern Mesopotamia around 5,300 years ago. The earliest cuneiform tablets are not stories. They are receipts. They are inventories. They are records of how much barley was received at the temple granary, how many goats were counted in a particular flock, how much beer was owed to a worker. Writing was, in its origins, a technology for managing complexity, for keeping track of things in a society that had grown too large and too complicated for human memory alone to manage. The idea that writing could be used for narrative, for poetry, for law, for correspondence, all of that came later. At the very beginning, writing was accounting software. It was a spreadsheet carved in clay. Fact 16. The shadoof, a simple counterweighted lifting device used to raise water from a river or canal up to the level of agricultural fields, has been in continuous use in Egypt and the Near East for approximately 4,000 years, and it is still used in parts of rural Egypt and sub-Saharan Africa today. It consists of a long wooden beam balanced on a pivot point, with a weight on one end and a bucket on the other. The counterweight means that lifting a full bucket of water requires very little effort. The weight does most of the work. It is perhaps the oldest surviving example of a machine that uses the principle of the lever to multiply human effort, and its persistence across 4 millennia speaks to how elegantly it solves its particular problem. There are technologies that have been invented and replaced and reinvented and replaced again in the 4,000 years since the shadoof first appeared. The shadoof is still the shadoof.
Fact 17. Bronze, the alloy of copper and tin that gives its name to the Bronze Age, represents a fundamental shift in the history of materials technology. Pure copper, which was worked by hammering as far back as 9,000 years ago, is relatively soft and loses its edge quickly. Bronze, which typically contains around 90% copper and 10% tin, is significantly harder, holds a sharper edge, and can be cast in molds to produce complex shapes. The smelting of copper from ore required temperatures around 1083 degrees Celsius, which is not achievable by an open fire. It required the development of furnaces with forced air supplies, bellows, to concentrate and sustain the necessary heat. Every step in the bronze-making process, from mining the ore to smelting the metal to alloying it with tin to casting finished tools and weapons, required specialist knowledge and specialized equipment. The Bronze Age was not just a new material, it was a new relationship between technology and specialized labor. Fact 18. The development of iron technology, which gradually displaced bronze across most of the ancient world beginning around 3,200 years ago, represents an interesting case where a harder technological problem yielded a more democratic result. Iron ore is vastly more abundant than the copper and tin needed for bronze. Bronze was, to some extent, a material of the elite. Complex supply chains were needed to bring together copper from one region and tin from another. Iron could be smelted almost anywhere that ore was found, and the ore was found nearly everywhere. The democratization of iron tools, hoes, axes, ploughshares, knives, accessible to ordinary farmers and craftspeople rather than exclusively to armies and palaces, may have contributed significantly to the agricultural and population expansions of the Iron Age. Part 3. Writing, Numbers, and the First Information Technology. Let the sound of Mesopotamia fade now. Let the smell of river mud and baking clay drift away into the quiet dark. We are moving now into a different kind of technology. Not the technology of things you can hold in your hand, but the technology of ideas. The technology of recording, transmitting, and preserving knowledge across time and distance. We are thinking about the history of information, and it begins, as most things begin, with a need. Fact 19. Cuneiform, which we touched on a moment ago, is worth lingering over a little longer. The name comes from the Latin word cuneus, meaning wedge, because the marks were made by pressing a reed stylus with a wedge-shaped tip into soft clay tablets. The clay was then dried in the sun, or, for important documents, fired in a kiln to create a more permanent record. Cuneiform began as pictographic, simple pictures representing objects, but evolved over centuries into a far more abstract system of wedge-shaped marks that could represent sounds as well as objects. By the time Sumerian cuneiform was fully developed, it could record poetry, mythology, mathematics, legal codes, and personal letters. The Epic of Gilgamesh, often called the oldest known work of literature, was first written down in cuneiform around 4,000 years ago. The technology of the clay tablet was the medium that made literature possible. Fact 20. The ancient Egyptians developed their own writing system, hieroglyphics, at roughly the same time as the Sumerians were developing cuneiform, around 5,000 years ago. Whether the two systems were invented independently, or whether knowledge of the idea of writing diffused from Mesopotamia to Egypt, is still debated by scholars. What is clear is that the two systems are fundamentally different in structure. Egyptian hieroglyphics combined phonetic signs, logograms representing whole words, and determinatives, signs that indicated the category of a word without contributing to its sound. The system was enormously complex, with a repertoire of several hundred signs in common use and several thousand in the full hieroglyphic canon. For most of Egyptian history, the ability to read and write hieroglyphics was restricted to a small class of trained scribes whose years of education represented a significant investment of time and social resources.
Fact 21. Papyrus, the writing material used by the ancient Egyptians for thousands of years, was a genuinely sophisticated manufactured product. The papyrus plant, Cyperus papyrus, grew abundantly in the Nile Delta. To make a writing surface, the inner pith of the stem was cut into long, thin strips. These strips were laid side by side in two perpendicular layers and pressed together while moist. As the strips dried, the natural sugars and starches in the plant fibers acted as an adhesive, binding the layers into a smooth, flexible sheet. The result was lighter, more flexible, and easier to write on than clay tablets, and it could be rolled into scrolls for convenient storage and transport. Papyrus was exported across the ancient Mediterranean world and remained the dominant writing surface in the region for over 3,000 years, until it was gradually replaced by parchment in the medieval period. Fact 22. The Phoenician alphabet, developed around 3,000 years ago along the coast of what is now Lebanon and Syria, is the direct ancestor of almost every alphabetic writing system in use in the world today. Earlier writing systems, like cuneiform and hieroglyphics, were extraordinarily complex, requiring years of study to master. The Phoenician alphabet had just 22 letters, all of them consonants. It was simple enough to be learned in weeks rather than years, and it was designed for practical use by merchants who needed a fast, portable system for keeping records of their trading transactions. The Greeks adopted the Phoenician alphabet and added vowel letters, a modification that made the system even more flexible and expressive. From the Greek alphabet descended the Latin alphabet. From the Latin alphabet descended the alphabet you are using right now.
Fact 23. 0 is a technology. This is not metaphorical. The concept of zero, a numeral that represents the absence of quantity, and a placeholder that makes positional number systems possible, had to be invented, and different cultures arrived at it at different times and through different routes. The Babylonians used a placeholder symbol in their number system as early as the 3rd century BCE. The Maya independently developed a concept of zero in their calendar system. But the zero that changed mathematics, the zero as a fully operational number that could be added, subtracted, and used in equations, was developed in India, with the mathematician Brahmagupta providing the first clear set of rules for arithmetic with zero and negative numbers in the 7th century CE. Without zero, positional number systems do not work. Without positional number systems, arithmetic of any complexity is extraordinarily laborious. Without efficient arithmetic, the entire subsequent history of science, engineering, and commerce becomes essentially impossible. Zero is a small word for a very large idea.
Fact 24. The abacus, in one form or another, is among the oldest computational devices in the world. Counting boards, flat surfaces with grooves or lines in which counting stones or beads could be arranged, appear in various forms across ancient Mesopotamia, Greece, Rome, and China. The bead frame abacus, familiar today from Chinese and Japanese mathematics education, was developed in China around 2,000 years ago, and refined into its current form during the Song dynasty around 1,000 years ago. A skilled abacus operator can perform addition, subtraction, multiplication, division, and even square roots with remarkable speed. Competitive with, and in some operations faster than, a modern electronic calculator for simple arithmetic. Abacus competitions are still held in Japan, where elementary school students train intensively and perform calculations that seem almost impossible by hand.
Fact 25. The Library of Alexandria, founded in the 3rd century BCE in the Egyptian city of Alexandria under the patronage of the Ptolemaic pharaohs, was among the most ambitious information technology projects of the ancient world. At its height, it is said to have contained hundreds of thousands of scrolls, works of history, philosophy, mathematics, poetry, medicine, and science from across the known world. The library employed agents who were sent to buy, borrow, or copy texts from anywhere they could be found. Ships arriving in Alexandria's harbour were reportedly required to lend their books for copying before they could depart. The library was not just a storage facility, it was a research institution, staffed by scholars who catalogued, cross-referenced, and studied the texts in its collection. Its destruction, or more accurately its gradual decline through a series of fires, funding cuts, and political disruptions over several centuries, represents one of the most profound information losses in human history.
Fact 26. The Antikythera mechanism is one of the most astonishing objects ever recovered from the ancient world.
Discovered in 1901 in the wreck of a Roman-era ship that sank near the Greek island of Antikythera around 60 BCE. It is a bronze device roughly the size of a shoebox, and it is the oldest known analog computer in human history. Inside its corroded casing, researchers have identified at least 30 interlocking bronze gears of extraordinary precision. It could track the movements of the sun and moon, predict eclipses, calculate the positions of the planets, and display the dates of the ancient Greek athletic games. The level of mechanical sophistication it represents did not reappear in European technology until the astronomical clocks of the 14th century, more than 1,000 years later. When scientists first began studying its internal structure using X-ray tomography in the 2000s, they found inscriptions inside that functioned like an operating manual. Someone more than 2,000 years ago built a machine and then wrote instructions for how to use it.
Fact 27. The first known algorithm, a step-by-step procedure for solving a mathematical problem, predates the word algorithm by over 1,000 years. The term comes from the name of the 9th century Persian mathematician Muhammad ibn Musa al-Khwarizmi, whose book on algebraic methods was translated into Latin in the 12th century, and whose name was Latinized into algorithmy. But the concept, a defined sequence of operations for arriving at a result, appears far earlier in Babylonian mathematical tablets from around 3,800 years ago. These tablets contain worked examples of how to solve quadratic equations and calculate square roots, presented as sequences of steps that, if followed correctly, always yield the right answer. They are algorithms. The person who chiseled those steps into a clay tablet in ancient Babylon was writing code. Part 4. Roman and Greek engineering. Aqueducts, domes and gears. The Mediterranean is silver in moonlight. The city of Rome is asleep, its 7 hills softening in the dark. But beneath the city and above it, something extraordinary is happening even in the stillness of night. Water is moving. Through pipes and channels cut into stone and brick, water is flowing into the city from springs in the hills 10, 20, 50 miles away, driven by nothing more than gravity and the precise, patient calculations of Roman engineers. Let us rest here for a while and talk about the age when the ancient world built its greatest structures. Fact 28. Roman concrete, known as opus caementitium, was one of the most remarkable material technologies of the ancient world, and remained unreplicated for over 1,000 years after the fall of the Roman Empire. Roman engineers mixed volcanic ash, specifically a type called pozzolana found near the Bay of Naples, with seawater and lime to create a cement that was stronger and more durable than ordinary mortar. Remarkably, this concrete actually gets stronger when exposed to seawater over time, because a mineral called tobermorite gradually forms within the material, reinforcing it further.
Modern researchers studying the ancient harbour structures at Caesarea Maritima and other Roman port cities have found that after 2,000 years of constant wave action, the concrete is more intact than Portland cement structures exposed to similar conditions for a fraction of that time. The recipe for this concrete was lost when Rome fell, and was not fully rediscovered until the 21st century, when mineralogists analysing samples from Roman harbours finally decoded how it worked.
Fact 29. The aqueducts of ancient Rome represent one of the most ambitious infrastructure projects in human history, and they were built without any mechanical pumping equipment whatsoever. Roman aqueducts worked entirely on gravity. The engineers who designed them had to calculate a gentle, precise downward slope, typically less than 1 meter of drop per kilometer of length, and maintain that slope consistently across the entire distance from the water source to the city, regardless of the terrain in between. Where valleys interrupted the route, they built arcade bridges, the graceful arched structures that still stand in Spain, France, and other parts of the former Roman Empire. At its height, the city of Rome was supplied by 11 aqueducts, with a combined length of over 500 kilometers, delivering an estimated 1 million cubic meters of water to the city every single day. For comparison, that is roughly equivalent to the daily water use of a modern city of several 100,000 people. Fact 30. The Pantheon in Rome, built during the reign of Emperor Hadrian around 125 CE, contains a concrete dome that remained the largest in the world for over 1,300 years, until the construction of the dome of the Florence Cathedral in the 15th century. The Pantheon's dome has a diameter of just over 43 meters and is cast from a single continuous pour of Roman concrete. Its genius lies in the way the engineers varied the composition and thickness of the concrete as they moved upward, using heavier, denser aggregates near the base where the structural loads are greatest, and progressively lighter materials, including pumice and even empty clay pots, near the apex to reduce weight. The oculus at the top of the dome, an open circular hole 9 meters in diameter that remains open to the sky to this day, was not a structural weakness, but a carefully calculated feature that allowed the dome to flex slightly under changing thermal loads without cracking. It has been continuously in use as a place of worship for almost 1,900 years, making it one of the best preserved ancient buildings in the world. Fact 31. Greek engineers of the Hellenistic period were experimenting with steam as a source of mechanical power more than 1,700 years before James Watt built his famous steam engine. Hero of Alexandria, a mathematician and engineer who lived in Egypt in the 1st century CE, described a device called the Eolopila, a hollow metal sphere mounted on a pivot with 2 curved nozzles projecting from its sides. When the sphere was filled with water and heated, steam escaped through the nozzles, and the reaction force caused the sphere to spin. It was, in essence, a reaction steam turbine. Hero
does not appear to have proposed any practical application for the Eolopila beyond its demonstration of an interesting natural principle. The ancient Mediterranean world had no shortage of slave labour, and there was therefore no economic incentive to develop labour-saving machinery. The Eolopila remained a philosophical curiosity for over 1,000 years, until the economic and social conditions of the Industrial Revolution finally created the incentive to develop steam power in earnest.
Fact 32. Roman roads were a genuinely sophisticated technology, not simply beaten earth tracks. A proper Roman road was built in multiple layers: a foundation of large stones, then a layer of smaller stones set in mortar, then a layer of gravel and concrete, topped with large, flat paving stones, carefully fitted together. The surface was slightly cambered, curved upward in the middle, so that rainwater drained off to the sides. Drainage ditches ran along both edges. The roads were typically elevated above the surrounding terrain to keep them dry in wet conditions. The total length of paved Roman roads at the height of the empire is estimated at around 85,000 kilometres, enough to circle the earth twice. Many sections remain in use today, incorporated into the foundations of modern roads. The phrase, "all roads lead to Rome," comes from the fact that the entire Roman road network was administered from a single golden milestone, the Miliarium Aureum, placed in the Forum in Rome by Emperor Augustus. Fact 33. Water clocks, or clepsydrai, were the most accurate timekeeping devices available in the ancient world before the development of mechanical clocks, and they were used in contexts ranging from law courts to military command. The basic principle is simple. Water drips at a controlled rate from one vessel into another, and the level in the receiving vessel indicates how much time has passed. But Greek and Roman engineers developed increasingly sophisticated versions that compensated for the fact that water drips faster when the vessel is full and slower as it empties, by using inflow vessels with conical shapes that maintained a more consistent outflow rate. The most elaborate ancient water clocks included floats that drove gear mechanisms to display animated figures, rotate celestial spheres, and ring bells or drop balls to mark the hours. Some had multiple dials showing the day of the week, the phase of the moon, and the positions of stars. They were not just timekeepers, they were mechanical theatres. Fact 34. The ancient Greeks and Romans understood and applied many of the fundamental principles of mechanics long before those principles were formally described in the scientific literature. The lever, the pulley, the wedge, the screw, and the wheel and axle were all in sophisticated practical use centuries before Archimedes systematized their theory. Archimedes himself famously claimed that given a lever long enough and a place to stand, he could move the world. But he also built it, at least in miniature. He used an elaborate system of compound pulleys to allow a single person to launch a fully laden merchant ship by pulling on a single rope. His machines for defending the city of Syracuse against Roman siege
including a giant claw that reportedly grabbed Roman ships and capsized them, may be partly legendary, but the underlying mechanical principles he worked with were entirely real and are the same principles that engineers use today. Fact 35. The catapult was not a single invention, but a family of siege weapons that evolved over several centuries of Greek and Roman military engineering. The earliest Greek catapults, developed in the 4th century BCE, used a simple spring mechanism, a twisted bundle of sinew or hair under tension, to launch projectiles. Later designs, including the ballista, which projected bolts like a crossbow, and the onager, which flung stones in a high arc, became increasingly large and powerful. Roman military engineers carried catapults as standard equipment on campaign, and could erect them and begin firing in the time it took to set up camp. At the siege of Jerusalem in 70 CE, Roman catapults reportedly hurled stones weighing over 20 kilograms, a distance of several hundred meters, with enough accuracy to hit individual soldiers on the city walls. Josephus, the Jewish historian who witnessed the siege, wrote that the stones were white and could be seen coming through the air, giving defenders just enough time to shout a warning. Fact 36. The Romans were master plumbers, and their understanding of water pressure and pipe hydraulics was remarkably sophisticated. Roman water supply systems used lead pipes. The word plumbing comes from plumbum, the Latin word for lead, to distribute water from public fountains and aqueducts to private homes, baths, and businesses. Wealthy Romans had running water directly into their homes. Roman engineers understood that water pressure in a pipe depends on the height difference between the source and the outlet, and they used this knowledge to create pressurized fountains and to carry water over and through hills using inverted siphons. The health consequences of lead piping were not understood at the time, and the question of whether chronic lead poisoning contributed to the decline of the Roman elite is still occasionally debated by historians and toxicologists, though most scholars now regard the theory as overstated. Part 5. Medieval Machines and the Quiet Centuries of Innovation. The Roman Empire is gone now. Its roads are crumbling at the edges. Its aqueducts are silting up. Its great buildings are being quarried for stone to build churches and farmhouses. The world has become quieter, smaller, more local. And yet, and this is something that popular history often gets wrong, the medieval period was not a technological dark age. It was a period of quiet, sustained, practical innovation, driven not by grand imperial ambition, but by the pressing everyday needs of ordinary people trying to farm, to grind grain, to keep time, and to stay warm. Fact 37. The heavy iron plough, already mentioned briefly, deserves its own detailed treatment here, because its impact on medieval Europe was transformative in a very specific, measurable way. The soils of northern and western Europe, the heavy, waterlogged clays of England, France, Germany, and the Low Countries had remained largely uncultivated since prehistoric times, not because people had not tried, but because existing plough technology was inadequate. The heavy plough, with its curved iron ploughshare, its coulter blade that cut vertically through the soil ahead of the ploughshare, and its mouldboard that turned the cut sod over to expose fresh earth, could break and turn these dense soils in a way that the lighter scratch plough could not. As the heavy plough spread across northern Europe in the early medieval period, agricultural productivity increased dramatically, feeding population growth and urban expansion. The spread of one piece of agricultural equipment effectively made medieval European civilization possible. Fact 38. Water wheels are one of the defining technologies of the medieval world, and they were far more versatile than simply grinding grain, though they did that too. Roman engineers had used water wheels for milling, but the medieval period saw an enormous expansion in the range of tasks powered by falling water. Water wheels drove hammers for forging iron. They powered bellows for smelting furnaces. They ran fulling mills that beat and compressed wool cloth to felt it. They drove saws for cutting timber. They pumped water out of mines. By the time of the Domesday Book in England in 1086, there were over 5,000 watermill sites recorded in the country, roughly one for every 50 households. Water power was medieval industrial power, and it shaped the landscape of every river valley in Europe.
Fact 39. The windmill appeared in Europe in the 12th century and rapidly became one of the most transformative technologies of the medieval world in regions where rivers were too flat or too scarce to provide reliable water power. The earliest European windmills were post mills. The entire structure of the mill, including the millstones and the sails, was mounted on a massive central post and could be rotated to face the wind by pushing against a long tail pole that projected from the back of the mill. The wooden gearing that transmitted the turning force of the sails to the millstones was a sophisticated piece of mechanical engineering, with toothed wooden wheels engaging with wooden pegs in a way that translated horizontal rotation into vertical rotation, and adjusted the speed ratio to turn the millstones at an appropriate speed. The development of the tower mill, in which only the cap and sails rotated rather than the entire building, was a significant improvement that made larger, more powerful mills possible.
Fact 40. The mechanical clock, one of the most consequential inventions in the history of technology, emerged in medieval Europe in the late 13th century. Before the mechanical clock, time was measured by water clocks, sundials, and the ringing of church bells at canonically defined hours of prayer. The first mechanical clocks, driven by weights and regulated by a mechanism called an escapement, were enormous devices installed in the towers of cathedrals and municipal buildings, and had no hands. They simply struck a bell at each hour. The word clock comes from the Latin clocca and the Old French cloque, meaning bell. The escapement, a device that releases the driving weight in controlled, discrete steps rather than allowing it to fall freely, is the critical invention at the heart of every mechanical clock ever built. It converts continuous downward force into a regular, countable series of ticks.
It is the first practical application of the idea of controlled periodic oscillation, which is the foundational principle of every timekeeping device, from the pendulum clock to the quartz crystal to the atomic clock.
Fact 41. Eyeglasses represent one of the most beneficial and most underappreciated inventions in human history. The optical principle behind them, that a curved piece of glass can refract light to focus it at a different point than it would naturally converge, was understood theoretically by Arab scholars, including Ibn al-Haytham, as early as the 11th century. But the first practical reading glasses, convex lenses mounted in frames that could be held before the eyes, appear in Italy around the 1280s. The impact was profound and immediate. Before eyeglasses, presbyopia, the progressive loss of close vision that affects almost every human being after the age of 40, meant that scholars, scribes, craftspeople, and administrators all faced a significant decline in their ability to do detailed work in their 40s and 50s. Eyeglasses effectively extended the productive working lives of educated and skilled people by decades. The accelerating pace of scholarship, legal analysis, and craft production in the late medieval and early modern periods is partly a story about what happens when you give literate people back the ability to read in their 40s and 50s. Fact 42. The astrolabe is a device so elegant and so compact that it seems almost impossible that it contains so much function in such a simple form. A flat brass disc, typically 6 to 12 inches in diameter, with a rotating grid of engraved lines and a pivoting sighting arm. An astrolabe could be used to determine the time, to find one's latitude, to predict the rising and setting times of the sun and stars, to calculate the height of buildings and mountains, and to cast horoscopes. It was the smartphone of the medieval world, a single portable device that performed dozens of functions that previously required separate instruments or complex mental calculation. The astrolabe was developed in the ancient Greek world and refined by Arab mathematicians in the Islamic Golden Age, before being transmitted to medieval Europe through translations of Arabic texts in the 12th century. For over 1,000 years, it was the most sophisticated portable scientific instrument in the world. Fact 43. Gunpowder was invented in China, almost certainly by accident, sometime during the Tang dynasty, probably in the 9th century CE. The story most commonly told is that alchemists experimenting with mixtures of charcoal, sulfur, and saltpeter, potassium nitrate, in search of an elixir of immortality, accidentally produced an explosive mixture instead. Chinese military engineers quickly developed practical military applications: fire arrows, fire lances, early grenades, and eventually the first guns, metal tubes from which a projectile was propelled by a gunpowder charge. The technology travelled westward along trade routes, reaching the Islamic world by the 13th century and Europe by the late 13th or early 14th century. The impact on European warfare was slow at first. Early cannon were expensive,
unreliable and not obviously superior to existing siege weapons, but ultimately total. Gunpowder weapons made castle walls obsolete, changed the balance between cavalry and infantry, and fundamentally restructured European society in ways that historians are still unpacking.
Fact 44. Medieval builders developed a suite of structural technologies that allowed them to construct buildings of unprecedented height and complexity. The pointed arch, which distributes the forces from the weight of a vault more efficiently than a round arch, was the foundational innovation of Gothic architecture. Combined with the flying buttress, an arched exterior support that transmitted the outward thrust of a vault wall away from the building and down to a separate pier, it allowed the walls of Gothic cathedrals to be thinned to the point where they could be filled almost entirely with stained glass. The structural logic of a Gothic cathedral is, in engineering terms, essentially the same as that of a modern steel-framed skyscraper, a skeleton of load-bearing members carrying the weight to the ground, with the walls between them reduced to thin, non-structural infill. Medieval masons arrived at this insight through centuries of empirical experimentation, trial and error on a monumental scale, with occasionally catastrophic results when vaults collapsed and towers fell. Fact 45. The spinning wheel, which appeared in Europe in the 13th century and had already been in use in India for centuries before that, transformed textile production in ways that ripple forward all the way to the Industrial Revolution. Before the spinning wheel, thread was spun by hand using a simple drop spindle, a weighted stick that was set spinning and then allowed to fall, twisting the fibres as it did. It was slow, labour-intensive work. The spinning wheel mechanized this process, allowing a spinner to produce thread much more quickly and consistently. The need to keep up with the increased output of spinners then drove innovation in weaving, in dyeing, and in cloth finishing. The textile industry was the engine of the medieval economy, and the spinning wheel was the most important piece of equipment in it. Part 6. Gutenberg, the printing press, and the spread of knowledge. A room somewhere in the city of Mainz, Germany. The year is somewhere in the mid-1450s. It smells of ink and metal and the particular sweetness of fresh paper. A man with ink-stained hands and a face creased with calculation is pressing damp paper against a bed of small metal letters, each one cast individually, each one identical to every other letter of its kind in the tray. He pulls the press screw and lifts the paper and holds it to the light. Ink on paper, letters, words, knowledge made portable, stored, reproducible. He has no idea what he has set in motion.
Fact 46. The printing press is not a single invention, but a system of technologies. And Johannes Gutenberg's genius was not in inventing any one of them, but in assembling them into a functional whole. The technologies he combined included movable type, cast in metal, each letter an individual piece that could be arranged in any combination and then rearranged. A hand press derived from the screw presses used for wine and olive oil production. Oil-based ink that adhered to metal type where water-based ink did not. And a paper supply chain capable of providing affordable paper in large quantities. None of these elements was entirely new. Gutenberg's innovation was the integration, finding the right combination and configuration to make the whole system work quickly, reliably, and economically. Fact 47. Movable type printing had been developed in China roughly 4 centuries before Gutenberg. The Chinese inventor Bi Sheng created movable type from baked clay around 1040 CE during the Song dynasty. Later, a government official named Wang Zhen developed wooden movable type and created an elaborate revolving table system for organizing the thousands of individual characters needed for printing in Chinese. Metal movable type was developed in Korea in the 13th century, predating Gutenberg by over 200 years. The reason that Asian movable type printing did not spread as rapidly or have the same transformative effect as Gutenberg's press has to do partly with the structure of the writing systems involved. Chinese and Korean printing required thousands of individual type pieces for the thousands of characters in those scripts, making typesetting far more labor-intensive than with an alphabet of only 26 letters.
Fact 48. The first major book produced on Gutenberg's printing press was the Bible, completed around 1455. Known as the Gutenberg Bible, or the 42-line Bible, for the number of lines on each page, it was produced in an edition of around 180 copies, roughly a third of them on vellum, processed calf skin, and the rest on paper. Producing a single handwritten Bible had previously required a trained scribe working full-time for approximately a year. Gutenberg's press could produce multiple copies simultaneously in a fraction of that time. The price of books fell dramatically as printing spread across Europe. Before the press, a single book might cost as much as several months of a labourer's wages. Within decades of Gutenberg, a printed book was within the economic reach of the prosperous merchant class. Within a century, even relatively modest households in Protestant Northern Europe were beginning to own books. Fact 49. The rate at which printing technology spread across Europe was remarkable. Gutenberg completed his Bible around 1455. By 1480, only 25 years later, printing presses were operating in over 100 cities across Europe, from London to Krakow to Naples. By 1500, just 45 years after Gutenberg, an estimated 9 million books had been printed in Europe, compared to perhaps a few 100,000 manuscripts that existed in all of European libraries before the press. The total amount of recorded information in Europe increased by several orders of magnitude within 2 generations. This was the first information explosion in human history. Fact 50. The printing press did not just reproduce existing texts, it changed what kinds of texts could exist. Before printing, the cost and labour of manuscript production meant that only texts judged sufficiently important by the institutional bodies,
The church, the universities, wealthy patrons that could afford to commission them were copied and preserved. Printing created a market. If enough people would pay for a book, a printer would produce it. This opened the door to popular literature, to vernacular writing in everyday languages rather than Latin, to technical manuals, to political pamphlets, to the kind of subversive, heterodox, or simply entertaining texts that no monastic scriptorium would ever have copied. The Protestant Reformation was, among other things, a printing revolution. Martin Luther's ideas spread with a speed that would have been physically impossible in a manuscript culture. Fact 51. The standardization of spelling and grammar in European languages is directly linked to the printing press. In manuscript culture, scribes copied texts with enormous regional and personal variation in spelling, punctuation, and even word choice. There was no such thing as correct spelling in the modern sense. The same word might appear in dozens of different forms across different manuscripts. When printers began producing the same texts in large quantities, they had a powerful economic incentive to standardize. Variations in spelling were inconsistencies that caused confusion and complaints from buyers. Over the decades following the introduction of printing in each country, spellings gradually stabilized and a standard form of each language began to emerge. The printing press did not just spread literacy, it created the conditions for the standardized national languages that we use today.
Fact 52. The illustration of printed books required the development of woodcut and later copperplate engraving as reproductive technologies. A woodcut illustration was carved in relief on a block of wood. The areas to remain white were cut away, and the raised lines that remained were inked and pressed against the paper at the same time as the type. Copperplate engraving worked in the opposite way. Lines were cut into a copperplate with a sharp tool. Ink was rubbed into the incised lines, the surface was wiped clean, and damp paper was pressed against it under high pressure, drawing the ink out of the incised lines. Copperplate engraving could produce far more detailed and tonally subtle images than woodcuts, but the plates wore out after a few hundred impressions and had to be re-engraved. Each of these printing technologies required specialist craftspeople, a whole new category of skilled workers whose livelihood depended on the maintenance and operation of the press.
Fact 53. The index and the table of contents are technologies that the printing press made necessary and made possible simultaneously. In a world of handwritten manuscripts, each copy of a book was unique, and the pages were not numbered consistently across copies. There was little point in providing a page reference for a reader who might be consulting a different copy of the text with different pagination. But printed books, being identical copies, made standardized pagination meaningful. The printer could guarantee that page 67 in one copy was the same as page 67 in every other copy. This made the index, a systematic guide to the contents of a book by subject, possible for the first time. The index may seem like a minor typographical convenience, but it transformed how readers interacted with texts, allowing them to navigate non-linearly and to treat a book as a reference tool rather than a text to be read from beginning to end. Part 7. The Birth of Electricity. Franklin, Faraday, and the Hidden Force. The room is dark now. You are drifting a little, perhaps. Let that be fine. Let the words wash over you like warm water. We are moving now into a different kind of history. The history of an invisible force that was always there, always crackling in thunderclouds and humming through amber rubbed against fur, but that no one had yet understood or harnessed. The history of electricity is the history of the world's most powerful and most transformative energy technology, and it begins in the most unassuming possible way, with someone rubbing a piece of amber and noticing with mild curiosity that it had begun to attract small pieces of fluff.
Fact 54. The word electricity comes from the ancient Greek word electron, meaning amber. The ancient Greeks had observed that amber, fossilized tree resin, when rubbed with fur, acquired the ability to attract small, lightweight objects like feathers and bits of dry grass. This phenomenon of static electricity was known to natural philosophers for over 2,000 years before anyone figured out what was causing it. It was simply one of the mysterious properties of amber, categorized alongside the magnetic properties of lodestone as an interesting natural curiosity. The connection between amber's attractive properties and the violent electricity of thunderstorms was not made until the 18th century. Fact 55. The Leyden jar, invented around 1745 in the Dutch city of Leiden, was the first device capable of storing a significant quantity of static electric charge and releasing it on demand. It consisted of a glass jar coated on both its inner and outer surfaces with metal foil, with a metal rod passing through the stopper and connecting to the inner lining. Static electricity generated by a friction machine could be accumulated in the jar and then discharged through a conductor, producing a visible spark and a sharp electric shock. Leyden jars could be connected in banks of dozens to store even larger charges. In the 1750s, travelling showmen were touring Europe, demonstrating the Leyden jar to audiences who paid for the entertainment of receiving a small electric shock or watching a spark jump through a small gap. Electricity, at this point in its history, was primarily a fairground attraction. Fact 56. Benjamin Franklin's famous kite experiment of 1752, in which he allegedly flew a kite in a thunderstorm and drew electrical sparks down the wet string to a Leyden jar, demonstrating that lightning was a form of electricity, is one of the most famous experiments in the history of science, and one of the most dangerous. It is quite likely that several European scientists who attempted to repeat the experiment were killed by the electrical discharge from lightning strikes. Franklin himself apparently escaped injury because he drew sparks from the cloud charge building up in the wet string, rather than from a direct lightning strike. The practical result of his work was the lightning rod, a pointed metal conductor attached to the highest point of a building and connected by a wire to the ground, providing a low-resistance path for lightning discharge that protected the building from fire.
Franklin's lightning rods spread rapidly across colonial America and Europe and saved countless buildings from destruction.
Fact 57. Alessandro Volta, the Italian physicist for whom the volt is named, invented the first practical electric battery in 1800. His voltaic pile consisted of alternating discs of zinc and silver or copper, separated by cardboard soaked in brine, stacked in a column. The chemical reaction between the brine and the two different metals produced a continuous flow of electric current, the first time in history that a steady, sustained electrical current had been available for scientific experiments. Within weeks of Volta's announcement, scientists across Europe were building their own voltaic piles and discovering new phenomena. They could use the current to decompose water into hydrogen and oxygen, to electroplate metals, and to cause muscular contractions in dead animals. Within a year of the battery's invention, the science of electrochemistry had essentially been created from scratch. Fact 58. The connection between electricity and magnetism, which turns out to be a deep, fundamental relationship in the physics of the universe, was discovered by accident. In 1820, the Danish physicist Hans Christian Ørsted was demonstrating a battery-powered circuit to a class of students when he noticed that whenever current flowed through the wire, a compass needle nearby swiveled to point towards the wire rather than toward magnetic north. He had discovered electromagnetism, the phenomenon by which a moving electric charge produces a magnetic field. This observation was the first hint that electricity and magnetism were not separate phenomena, but two aspects of the same underlying force. The theoretical unification of electricity, magnetism, and light into a single consistent electromagnetic theory came 40 years later in the hands of the Scottish mathematician James Clerk Maxwell, in what is generally regarded as one of the greatest intellectual achievements in the history of physics. Fact 59. Michael Faraday is one of the most remarkable figures in the history of science, partly because of what he achieved, and partly because of where he started. Born in London in 1791 as the son of a blacksmith, Faraday had almost no formal education. He learned chemistry and physics by reading the books he bound as a bookbinder's apprentice and by attending public lectures at the Royal Institution. He eventually became laboratory assistant to the chemist Humphrey Davy and went on to make discoveries that transformed the modern world. In 1831, Faraday demonstrated electromagnetic induction, the phenomenon by which a changing magnetic field produces an electric current in a nearby conductor. This is the principle on which every electrical generator ever built is based. When you switch on a light, when you plug in a phone, when a city draws power from a coal or nuclear or wind power station, the ultimate source of that electricity is Faraday's discovery that a magnet moving inside a coil of wire will drive a current through it. Fact 60. The first electric motors were demonstrated within a year of Faraday's discovery of electromagnetic induction.
and the conceptual principle behind them is the reverse of the generator. Where a generator converts mechanical motion into electrical current, a motor converts electrical current into mechanical motion. Faraday himself built a simple device in 1821, before his induction work, in which a current-carrying wire rotated continuously around a permanent magnet. This was the first electric motor, though it was too weak and impractical to do useful work. The development of motors powerful enough to be practically useful took several more decades and required improvements in both the magnets and the electrical supply.
Fact 61. Thomas Edison's system of electrical distribution, launched in New York City in 1882 with the opening of the Pearl Street Station, was the world's first public electrical power system. Pearl Street Station initially supplied direct current electricity to 82 customers in a 1 square mile area of Lower Manhattan, powering around 400 incandescent lamps. Within months, the number of customers had grown to over 500. Within 2 years, the station served thousands of customers. Edison's system used direct current, electricity flowing in a single direction, which was simple and reliable, but had a significant limitation. It could not be transmitted efficiently over long distances. The alternating current system, promoted by Nikola Tesla and implemented commercially by George Westinghouse, could be transformed to high voltage for long-distance transmission, and then stepped back down for household use, making it far more suitable for large-scale power distribution. The so-called War of Currents between Edison and Westinghouse in the late 1880s was, in engineering terms, won decisively by Tesla and Westinghouse, and alternating current became the global standard for electrical power distribution. Fact 62. The incandescent light bulb, which more than any other single invention symbolizes the idea of invention itself, was not invented by Thomas Edison alone. The principle, passing an electric current through a thin filament of material with high electrical resistance until it glows, was demonstrated by numerous inventors before Edison, including the Englishman Joseph Swan, who demonstrated a working incandescent bulb in Newcastle in 1879, the same year as Edison's famous Menlo Park demonstration. What Edison invented was not just a bulb, but a system, a practical, commercially viable filament material, a reliable vacuum pump to evacuate the bulb, a socket, a switch, a meter, a generator, and an entire distribution network. He designed everything from the power station to the lamp socket as an integrated system, with each component matching the specifications of all the others. That systems-level thinking was his real contribution, and it is what made the electrical age actually arrive. Part 8. Steam, Steel, and the Industrial Revolution. We are in England now, and it is the 18th century, and the air is full of coal smoke and the clang of iron and the low rhythmic thudding of pumps working in the dark underground. Everything is about to change. Not overnight, it never happens overnight, but
change is accumulating in workshops and forges and collieries, and it will eventually reach the surface and transform the entire world.
Fact 63. The atmospheric steam engine, invented by Thomas Newcomen around 1712, was not primarily a transportation device or a manufacturing machine. It was a pump. Its specific purpose was to remove water from coal mines, which flooded as they were dug ever deeper, threatening to drown the miners and halt production. Newcomen's engine worked by filling a cylinder with steam, then condensing the steam by spraying cold water into the cylinder. The condensation created a partial vacuum, and atmospheric pressure pushing down on a piston drove the pump. It was crude, slow, and enormously inefficient. Most of the heat energy in the coal being burned went up the chimney rather than into useful work. But it worked, and it kept the mines pumping, and it was the first practical machine to use heat to do work on a significant scale. There were over 100 Newcomen engines operating in British coal mines by 1733. Fact 64. James Watt did not invent the steam engine. What he invented, beginning around 1765, was a dramatically improved steam engine. The key innovation was the separate condenser. Instead of condensing the steam inside the working cylinder, Watt piped the used steam into a separate, permanently cold chamber where it condensed. This meant the working cylinder could be kept hot at all times, eliminating the enormous waste of energy that occurred in Newcomen's engine every time the hot cylinder was cooled by the condensing water. Watt's improved engine used roughly 3 times less coal than Newcomen's to do the same amount of work. This dramatic improvement in fuel efficiency made steam power economically viable for a much wider range of applications, not just mine pumping. Watt also developed the rotary steam engine, converting the up and down motion of the piston into continuous rotation, which made steam power applicable to mills, factories, and eventually transportation. The unit of power, the watt, is named in his honour. Fact 65. The textile industry was the first major industry to be transformed by the Industrial Revolution, and the change was driven by a sequence of mechanical innovations that each created a bottleneck that the next innovation resolved. James Hargreaves' spinning jenny, patented in 1770, allowed a single spinner to work multiple spindles simultaneously, dramatically increasing thread production. But faster thread production meant that weavers could not keep up. Edmund Cartwright's power loom, patented in 1785, mechanized weaving. Faster weaving required faster spinning, which drove further refinement of spinning machinery. The cotton gin, invented by Eli Whitney in the United States in 1793, mechanized the separation of cotton fibers from their seeds, dramatically reducing the cost of raw cotton. Each innovation in one part of the production chain created pressure on the adjacent steps to catch up, driving a cascade of further innovation. Fact
1866. The factory system, the concentration of many workers using many machines in a single purpose-built facility powered by a central steam engine, was itself a technological innovation, not just an organizational one. Before the factory, most manufactured goods were produced by skilled workers in their homes or small workshops, each controlling their own tools and their own time. The factory made the human worker a component in a larger machine, synchronized to the rhythm of the steam engine and the demands of a production line. This was a new kind of human relationship to technology, one in which the machine did not serve the worker, but the worker served the machine. The social consequences of this inversion were enormous and are still playing out.
Fact 67. The first steam locomotive, built by the Cornish engineer Richard Trevithick in 1804, ran on an iron tramway at the Merthyr Tydfil Iron Works in Wales, and hauled 10 tons of iron and 70 men, a distance of about 10 miles. It was slow, it was heavy, and it broke the cast iron rails under its weight. The track of the period was not designed for self-propelled vehicles. But the idea was demonstrated. George Stephenson, a self-educated colliery engineer, refined the steam locomotive through the 1810s and 1820s to the point of practical viability. His locomotive Rocket, which won the Rainhill Trials competition in 1829, reached a top speed of about 30 miles per hour, which was faster than any human being had previously travelled on land. The world's first public steam railway, the Liverpool and Manchester Railway, opened in 1830 and immediately began transforming commerce, travel, and the relationship between cities. Fact 68. The construction of the British railway network in the 1830s and 1840s was one of the largest and most disruptive infrastructure projects in human history to that point. The so-called railway mania of 1845 to 1847 saw over 6,000 miles of railway authorised by Parliament in just 2 years, at an estimated total cost of over £200 million, an almost unimaginable sum, equivalent to a significant fraction of Britain's entire GDP at the time. The construction employed hundreds of thousands of workers, known as navvies, many of them Irish immigrants, who built the cuttings, embankments, tunnels and viaducts entirely by hand and by horse. The railway standardised time across Britain. Before the railways, every town kept its own local time based on the position of the sun, but the railway timetables required a single consistent time across the whole network. The railway, in other words, did not just change how people travelled, it changed how people understood time itself. Fact 69. Steel. Iron, alloyed with a precise small percentage of carbon, is one of the foundational materials of the modern world, and the Bessemer process, developed by Henry Bessemer in 1856, made the mass production of steel economically feasible for the first time. Before Bessemer, steel was expensive to produce and available only in small quantities. The Bessemer converter,
a large pear-shaped vessel in which molten pig iron was treated by blowing air through it, could convert several tons of iron into steel in about 20 minutes at a fraction of the previous cost. Cheap steel meant steel rails, which were far more durable than iron rails under the weight of heavy locomotives. Steel rails made possible the heavier trains and higher speeds of the late Victorian railway. Cheap steel also meant steel-framed buildings, steel ships, steel bridges, and eventually the entire steel infrastructure of the 20th century.
Fact 70. The relationship between the Industrial Revolution and child labour is a dark and important part of the technology story. Industrial machinery, particularly the early spinning and weaving machines, was often designed in ways that made small children useful in ways that adults were not. Children could crawl under machines to retrieve broken threads or to clean accumulated fluff from mechanisms while the machine was running. They were small enough to work as scavengers in coal mines, pulling loaded coal wagons through passages too small for adults. They were cheap, they were plentiful, and before the emergence of compulsory schooling, they had no other obvious place to be. The Factory Acts in Britain, beginning in 1833, progressively restricted child labour in textile mills, mines, and other industries, driven partly by humanitarian concern, partly by the growing labour movement, and partly by the development of machines that were capable of doing what child workers had previously done.
Fact 71. The Crystal Palace, constructed in London's Hyde Park for the Great Exhibition of 1851, was itself a technological achievement as significant as many of the exhibits it contained. Designed by the gardener and greenhouse architect Joseph Paxton, it was built almost entirely of prefabricated cast iron and plate glass, assembled from standardized components in a matter of months. The building covered over 900,000 square feet and enclosed large trees that could not be felled without public outcry. It was the first major building in history to be constructed from mass-produced interchangeable industrial components, a prefabricated building before the term existed. When the exhibition closed, the Crystal Palace was dismantled and re-erected in a modified form at a new site in South London, demonstrating another of its innovations. It was designed to be taken apart and moved. Part 9. The telegraph, telephone, and the wiring of the world. Let the machines of the Industrial Revolution grow quieter now. Let the steam settle and the forges cool. We are moving into a different kind of revolution. Not a revolution of muscle and metal, but of signal and wire. The world is about to shrink, not physically, but informationally. For the first time in human history, a message is about to travel faster than any horse or ship that could carry it.
Fact 72. The electrical telegraph was not invented by Samuel Morse.
Multiple inventors developed working telegraph systems in the 1830s, including William Fothergill Cooke and Charles Wheatstone in England, whose Cooke-Wheatstone telegraph system was adopted by the Great Western Railway in 1815 and almost immediately demonstrated its value when it was used to transmit news of a murder suspect's railway journey, leading to his arrest at the London terminus. Morse's system, developed independently in the United States, used a different approach, a simple on-off signalling system in which dots and dashes of different durations represented letters and numbers. Morse code, as it became known, was simpler to learn and to operate than competing systems, and was ultimately adopted as the international standard. Fact 73. Before the telegraph, the fastest means of transmitting information over long distances was a rider on a fast horse, which could cover perhaps 20 or 30 miles per hour under ideal conditions, and which could relay information perhaps 100 or 200 miles in a day. News of Napoleon's defeat at the Battle of Waterloo in 1815 reached London from Belgium, a distance of about 300 miles, roughly 2 days after the battle ended. By the time the first intercity telegraph lines were operational in the mid-1840s, a message could travel hundreds of miles in minutes. The conceptual shock of this was genuinely disorienting to people who experienced it. A technology that caused information to travel faster than the human body, faster than any animal, faster than any wind. This was something genuinely new under the sun.
Fact 74. The first transatlantic telegraph cable was successfully laid in 1866, after 2 failed attempts in 1857 and 1858. The 1858 cable worked for only about 3 weeks before failing due to damage from high voltage treatment intended to boost the signal. The successful 1866 cable was laid by the SS Great Eastern, then the largest ship in the world, which used miles of specially designed gutta-percha insulated copper cable coiled in massive tanks in its holds. The cable connecting Valentia Island in Ireland to Heart's Content in Newfoundland was over 3,000 kilometers long and carried traffic between Europe and North America for years before being replaced by more modern cables. Before the cable, the fastest communication between Europe and America was by steamship, which took about 10 days. After the cable, a message could be sent in minutes, though at substantial cost. Early transatlantic telegrams charged per word, and a single telegram could cost the equivalent of hundreds of dollars in today's money. Fact 75. The telephone was invented in a period of intense, overlapping competition among multiple inventors, and the question of priority is more contested than the popular history suggests. Alexander Graham Bell filed his patent on February 14th, 1876, just hours before a competing inventor named Elisha Gray filed a patent caveat for a similar device. Bell's patent, number 174465, is often called the most valuable patent ever issued because it became the legal foundation for the Bell Telephone Company and its successor, AT&T, which dominated American telecommunications for over a century.
Bell's telephone transmitted speech by converting sound waves into fluctuating electrical current, and then converting that current back into sound waves at the receiving end. His famous first message, "Mr. Watson, come here, I want to see you," was spoken to his assistant Thomas Watson in an adjoining room in his laboratory in Boston on March 10, 1876.
Fact 76. Early telephone exchanges were operated entirely by human switchboard operators, almost all of them women by the early 1880s, who connected calls manually by plugging cords into the appropriate jacks. The first telephone exchange opened in New Haven, Connecticut in January 1878 with 21 subscribers. By the end of 1880, there were over 47,000 telephone subscribers in the United States. The human operator was a central feature of telephone communication for decades, a real present intermediary between callers. If you did not know a subscriber's number, you simply picked up the receiver and asked the operator. Many early telephone exchanges in small towns and rural areas employed a single operator who knew every subscriber personally and their likely whereabouts at any time of day. The telephone directory, printed list of subscribers and their numbers, was first published in New Haven in February 1878, just a few weeks after the first exchange opened. It was a single sheet of cardboard with 50 names. Fact 77. Morse code saved lives at sea for over a century after its development. The International Distress Signal, SOS, 3 dots, 3 dashes, 3 dots, was adopted by International Maritime Convention in 1906, following the development of wireless telegraphy. It was chosen not because the letters spelled anything in particular, but because the pattern was distinctive and easy to transmit, even by someone with no radio training in an emergency. The RMS Titanic's wireless operators famously transmitted both SOS and the older CQD distress signal in the hours after the ship struck the iceberg in April 1912. The use of wireless telegraphy was directly responsible for the rescue of over 700 survivors by the RMS Carpathia. The lack of wireless contact between Titanic and the nearby SS Californian, whose radio operator had retired for the night just 30 minutes before Titanic struck the iceberg, contributed to the failure of that vessel to respond. Fact 78. The development of the telephone network required the solution of an enormous number of technical problems that are easy to take for granted now, but were genuinely difficult in the 1880s and 1890s. Telephone signals attenuate, grow weaker as they travel along copper wire. On short distances, this is manageable, but for the transcontinental telephone lines of the United States, the signal would fade to nothing long before reaching its destination without amplification. The loading coil, developed independently by Michael Pupin in the US and George Campbell at AT&T, allowed signals to travel further by adding inductance at regular intervals along the line. But transcontinental telephony did not become possible until the development of the vacuum tube amplifier
around 1913, which allowed signals to be boosted at repeater stations. The first transcontinental telephone call was made between New York and San Francisco in January 1915.
Fact 79. The telegraph and telephone systems of the late 19th century created an entirely new category of work, and along with it, an entirely new category of worker, the female office worker. Before the telegraph, the communication and record-keeping functions of businesses were performed almost exclusively by men. The telegraph company offices, and then the telephone exchanges, and then the typewriter-equipped offices of the 1880s and 1890s were among the first workplaces to employ women in large numbers in clerical roles. By 1900, women constituted about 3/4 of the telephone operators in the United States. This shift was partly about economics. Women were paid less than men for the same work, and partly about social attitudes about which kinds of work were appropriate for women. But regardless of the reasons, the information technology revolution of the late 19th century fundamentally changed the gender composition of the office, with consequences for women's economic independence and social status that are still unfolding. Part 10. Photography, cinema, and the capture of light. The light is changing now. Something new is entering the world. Not the heavy thud of a steam engine or the urgent clatter of a telegraph key, but something almost impossibly delicate, the capture of light itself. For all of human history, the only record of a face, a landscape, a moment, was what a human hand could draw or paint. Now, light itself is doing the work. Now, the world is beginning to remember itself. Fact 80. The camera obscura, the optical device that projects an inverted image of the outside world onto a surface inside a darkened room or box, has been understood and used by artists and natural philosophers since at least the 11th century, when the Arab scholar Ibn al-Haytham described it in his Book of Optics. By the 16th century, portable camera obscura boxes were being used by artists to trace accurate perspective drawings of landscapes and buildings. The fundamental optical principle, light passing through a small hole creates an inverted image on the opposite wall, was likely discovered and rediscovered independently in multiple cultures throughout history. What no one could figure out for centuries was how to make the projected image stick, how to make the camera remember what it was seeing. Fact 81. The first permanent photograph was made by the French inventor Joseph Nicephore Niepce in 1826 or 1827. Titled View from the Window at Le Gras, it shows the rooftops and courtyard visible from the upstairs window of Niepce's country estate in Burgundy. To make it, Niepce coated a pewter plate with a bitumen compound that hardened when exposed to light and dissolved when washed with lavender oil, leaving behind a faint, barely visible image. The exposure time was approximately 8 hours.
Because the sun moved during the 8-hour exposure, the image shows sunlight illuminating both the left and right sides of the buildings simultaneously, a physical impossibility in a single snapshot. This ghost of a double-lit day is one of the strangest and most poignant things in the entire history of photography.
Fact 82. The daguerreotype, announced publicly in Paris in 1839 by Louis-Jacques Mondet Daguerre, was the first photographic process to achieve widespread practical use. It produced extraordinarily sharp, detailed images on a silver-coated copper plate, with a tonal richness that many photographers consider still unsurpassed by any subsequent photographic technology. Within months of its announcement, daguerreotype studios were opening in cities across Europe and North America, and portrait photography became instantly enormously popular. Before photography, a painted portrait was a luxury affordable only by the wealthy. The daguerreotype made it possible for the first time for ordinary working people to have a permanent record of their own face. The social significance of this cannot be overstated. For the vast majority of human history, most people left no visual trace. The daguerreotype changed that. Fact 83. The development of photographic film, a flexible, light-sensitive material that could be produced in long rolls and used in handheld cameras, is primarily associated with George Eastman, who introduced his Kodak camera in 1888 with the advertising slogan, "You press the button, we do the rest." The camera came loaded with a roll of film capable of 100 exposures. When the film was finished, the entire camera was sent back to the Kodak factory in Rochester, New York, where the film was developed, prints were made, and the camera was reloaded and returned to the owner. Photography was transformed from a technically demanding craft requiring specialist knowledge and equipment into a simple consumer activity. Eastman's business model, making money not just from the camera but from the film and processing, established a template for technology commercialization that has been replicated countless times since. Fact 84. Thomas Edison's motion picture system, developed with his assistant William Dickson in the early 1890s, consisted of a camera called the kinetograph and a viewing device called the kinetoscope. The kinetoscope was a cabinet with a peephole through which a single viewer could watch a short film loop, typically about 30 seconds long, by cranking a handle. Edison saw the kinetoscope as a kind of vending machine for entertainment, with each machine serving one customer at a time. He did not initially invest in projecting film onto a screen for audiences, reportedly because he thought the audience would exhaust the film library too quickly. This assessment was mistaken, and it was the French brothers Auguste and Louis Lumière who gave the first public film screening for a paying audience in Paris on December the 28th, 1895, projecting short films onto a screen for an audience of 33 people in the basement of the Grand Café. Cinema was born that evening. Fact 85. The early film industry was not just an entertainment technology, it was also a documentary
technology of unprecedented power. The Lumiere brothers and their camera operators dispatched to locations around the world, Japan, Russia, Egypt, Argentina, not to make fictional narratives, but to record the world as it was. Workers leaving a factory, a train arriving at a station, waves breaking on a beach. People seeing projected images of waves reportedly flinched and moved backward in their seats. The reality effect of moving images, the way the brain responds to them as if they are real rather than representations, was something entirely new in human experience, and people in 1895 and 1896 encountering projected film for the first time had no framework for understanding what they were experiencing.
Fact 86. Colour photography, which seems like it ought to have arrived soon after black and white photography, took surprisingly long to develop. The first practical colour photography process, the autochrome Lumiere, was introduced by the Lumiere brothers in 1907, nearly 70 years after Daguerre's announcement. Autochromes used a screen of microscopic grains of potato starch dyed red, green and blue to create a mosaic colour filter. They produced gorgeous, impressionistic images, but each print was unique, fragile, and could only be viewed as a transparency held up to light. The development of colour-negative film capable of producing multiple prints did not achieve widespread practical use until Kodachrome in 1935 and Kodacolour in 1942. Part 11. Radio, Television and the Age of Broadcasting. Settle a little deeper now. The world is getting louder in the most counterintuitive way. It is filling with invisible signals. Electromagnetic waves are moving through the air around you at this very moment, billions of them, carrying music and voices and data. They always have. We just had to learn how to make them, and then how to listen. Fact 87. Guglielmo Marconi is usually credited with inventing radio, but the electromagnetic waves that make radio possible were predicted mathematically by James Clerk Maxwell in the 1860s, demonstrated in a laboratory by Heinrich Hertz in 1888, for whom Hertz, the unit of frequency, is named, and used for practical wireless telegraphy by Marconi, beginning in 1895. Marconi was less a lone inventor than a skilled engineer and businessman who assembled existing theoretical knowledge and experimental demonstrations into a working commercial system. His great achievement was demonstrating that radio waves could travel much farther than initially expected, across the Bristol Channel in 1897, across the English Channel in 1899, and across the Atlantic Ocean in 1901, when his station in Cornwall transmitted signals received by his station in St. John's, Newfoundland. Fact 88. The first commercial radio broadcasting station, KDKA, in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, began regular broadcasting on November 2, 1920, with coverage of the US presidential election results, Warren Harding's victory over James Cox. Within 3 years, there were over 500 licensed radio stations broadcasting in the United States.
The speed of radio's adoption as a household technology was extraordinary, even by the standards of subsequent communications technologies. By 1922, over 60,000 radio sets had been sold in the United States. By 1924, over 1.5 million. By the end of the decade, radio was present in a significant fraction of American homes. Radio transformed domestic life in ways that are difficult to fully appreciate now. It brought the voices of political leaders, musicians, athletes, and comedians directly into people's living rooms for the first time.
Fact 89. John Logie Baird demonstrated the world's first working television system in London in January 1926, transmitting recognizable images of faces to an audience of about 50 scientists and engineers in his attic laboratory in Soho. Baird's system was mechanical. It used a spinning disc perforated with holes in a spiral pattern to scan the image, producing a picture of only 30 lines. The image was tiny, flickering, and barely recognizable, but it worked. The BBC began the world's first regular public television broadcasts using a fully electronic system in 1936, and Baird's mechanical system was quickly superseded. Within just 10 years of his 1926 demonstration, the fundamental technology had been transformed beyond recognition. Fact 90. The first television remote control, introduced by Zenith in 1950, was called Lazy Bones, and it was connected to the television by a wire long enough to reach across a living room. A cordless remote, using a flash of light to send a signal, was introduced in 1955, but it had a significant flaw. Sunlight and other bright light sources could accidentally trigger channel changes. The solution was an ultrasonic remote, introduced in 1956, which transmitted an inaudible high-frequency sound, a different frequency for each button. It worked well, except that it was sometimes accidentally triggered by jingling keys, clinking glasses, or the sound of a dog collar. Infrared remote controls, which operate on the same principle as today's remotes, were developed in the 1980s and became standard. The remote control seems like a trivial comfort, but it fundamentally changed how people interacted with television, enabling much more passive, channel-surfing forms of viewing. Fact 91. Television advertising transformed not just commerce, but culture in ways that are still being analysed. Before television, national advertising relied primarily on print media and radio. Television added the visual dimension, the ability to show a product, to demonstrate it, to associate it with images of aspiration, family, success, and pleasure in a moving, vivid, emotionally engaging format. The 30-second television advertisement, which became the standard commercial unit by the 1960s, is itself a fascinating and often overlooked art form, a narrative compressed to an almost haiku-like brevity, designed to create an emotional impression that outlasts the moment of viewing. Fact 92. The transistor radio
introduced in the mid-1950s following the commercial development of the transistor at Bell Laboratories, brought portable, personal electronic entertainment to the mass market for the first time. The first commercially successful transistor radio, the Regency TR-1, was introduced in 1954 and sold for $49.99, equivalent to roughly $500 today. Within a few years, cheaper transistor radios made in Japan were flooding the American market, making personal, portable radio accessible to teenagers and young adults who could listen to rock and roll and rhythm and blues outside the hearing and supervision of their parents. The transistor radio was, in an indirect but real sense, a contributing technology to the social and cultural revolutions of the late 1950s and 1960s. Part 12. Computers. From room-sized machines to pocket supercomputers.
The night is deep now. You may be very close to sleep, and that is exactly right. Let these last facts come to you gently, like thoughts arriving just before dreaming. We are almost at the present moment, almost at the world you know. But before we arrive there, we have to pass through the cavernous rooms of the first computers. Machines so large they needed their own buildings, consuming power that lit cities, performing calculations that changed the course of history. Fact 93. Charles Babbage, the eccentric English mathematician and inventor, designed two mechanical computing machines in the 19th century that were never completed during his lifetime, but were so conceptually advanced that historians consider them genuine precursors to the modern computer. His difference engine, designed in the 1820s, was a mechanical calculator capable of computing polynomial functions to many decimal places. His analytical engine, designed in the 1830s, was even more ambitious. A general-purpose mechanical computer with a separate memory store, an arithmetic processing unit, and the ability to be programmed with punched cards inspired by the Jacquard loom. Ada Lovelace, the daughter of the poet Byron, wrote what is considered the first computer program, an algorithm for calculating Bernoulli numbers for the analytical engine in 1843. Neither machine was built in Babbage's lifetime, partly due to technical difficulties, partly due to funding problems, and partly due to Babbage's habit of abandoning a design whenever a better idea occurred to him. A working reconstruction of the difference engine, built by the Science Museum in London following Babbage's original plans, was completed in 1991 and worked exactly as designed.
Fact 94. ENIAC, the Electronic Numerical Integrator and Computer, was completed in 1945 at the Moore School of Electrical Engineering at the University of Pennsylvania, and is widely considered the first general-purpose electronic digital computer. It was enormous, nearly 10 feet high, over 100 feet long, weighing about 30 tons. It contained 18,000 vacuum tubes, 10,000 capacitors, 70,000 resistors, and 6,000 switches. It consumed 150 kilowatts of power, enough to power several hundred modern homes. Programming it did not involve software in any modern sense.
Reprogramming ENIAC for a new task required physically rewiring connections on its massive panels, a process that could take days. When it was finally running, it could perform 5,000 additions per second, faster than any human calculator by an enormous margin. Its first major task was performing calculations related to the design of the hydrogen bomb.
Fact 95. The transistor, invented at Bell Laboratories in December 1947 by William Shockley, John Bardeen, and Walter Brattain, is arguably the most important invention of the 20th century. A transistor is a semiconductor device that can amplify an electrical signal or switch a current on and off, performing the same basic function as a vacuum tube, but in a component that is tiny, requires almost no power, generates very little heat, and can be manufactured in enormous quantities at very low cost. The replacement of vacuum tubes by transistors in computers over the 1950s and 1960s reduced the size of computers by several orders of magnitude and dramatically increased their reliability. And transistors could be made smaller, much smaller. The first integrated circuit, combining multiple transistors and other components on a single chip of silicon, was demonstrated by Jack Kilby at Texas Instruments in 1958 and by Robert Noyce at Fairchild Semiconductor in 1959. From that moment, the history of computers became a story of relentless miniaturization. Fact 96. Moore's Law, formulated by Intel co-founder Gordon Moore in 1965, observed that the number of transistors on an integrated circuit had doubled approximately every 2 years since the invention of the integrated circuit, and predicted that this trend would continue. For over 50 years, this observation held with remarkable accuracy. The first commercial integrated circuits of 1960 contained a handful of transistors. By the time of writing, modern chips contain over 100 billion transistors. Each transistor is now measured in nanometers, billionths of a meter. The smallest transistors currently in production are just a few atoms across. The cumulative effect of 50 years of transistor doubling is an increase in computing power of roughly 1 trillion-fold. A modern smartphone contains more computing power than all the computers that existed in the world combined in 1970. Combined. Fact 97. The personal computer revolution of the late 1970s and early 1980s was not driven by large corporations, but by a loose community of enthusiasts, hobbyists, and young engineers who were fascinated by the idea of having a computer of their own. Not shared computer time rented from a university or business mainframe, but a personal machine they could own and use however they liked. The Altair 8800, introduced in January 1975 on the cover of Popular Electronics magazine, is often cited as the starting point of the personal computer era. It came as a kit and had no keyboard, no display,
and no software beyond what the buyer could write themselves. Yet it sold thousands of units to enthusiastic hobbyists who spent hours flipping front panel switches to enter programs one binary digit at a time. It was this machine that inspired a young Bill Gates and Paul Allen to drop out of Harvard and found Microsoft to write programming languages for it, and that Steve Wozniak and Steve Jobs observed before designing the Apple I. Part 13. The Internet, the Web, and the Digital Present. We are almost home now, almost in the world you know. But even the world you know has a history, and that history is stranger and more recent than you might think. The Internet, the thing you are almost certainly using right now to watch or listen to this video, is younger than many of the people watching it. Let us drift into it gently, the way you drift into sleep.
Fact 98. ARPANET, the direct ancestor of the modern Internet, sent its first message on October 29th, 1969, between a computer at UCLA and a computer at the Stanford Research Institute in Menlo Park, California, a distance of about 350 miles. The intended first message was the word login. The system crashed after transmitting the first two letters. The actual first message sent over the Internet was therefore low, which, as has been noted by many people since, is not a bad way to say hello to the future. ARPANET was a project of the US Defense Department's Advanced Research Projects Agency, and its design was influenced by a concept developed by the RAND Corporation's Paul Baran, who proposed a communications network with no central node that could be taken out by a nuclear strike. A decentralized web of connections in which messages could be routed around damage. This architecture, in which there is no center and every node can communicate with every other node, is the foundation of the Internet as it exists today.
Fact 99. The World Wide Web, which is what most people mean when they say the Internet, though the two are technically distinct, was invented by Tim Berners-Lee, a British physicist working at the CERN Particle Physics Laboratory in Switzerland in 1989 and 1990. Berners-Lee proposed it as a system for sharing research documents among the scientists at CERN, who were using many different computers with many different operating systems, and needed a way to share information easily across incompatible systems. His proposal combined three existing ideas: the Internet, the underlying network, hypertext, text containing links to other text, and URLs, addresses for documents, into a single unified system. The world's first website, which described what the World Wide Web was and how to use it, went live on August 6, 1991. It is still accessible at its original address. Berners-Lee chose not to patent the web or charge for its use. He gave it to the world for free. This decision, arguably one of the most consequential acts of generosity in the history of technology, allowed the web to grow without restriction and become the global information infrastructure it is today.
Fact 100. The first email was sent in 1971 by Ray Tomlinson, an engineer working on ARPANET, who sent a message to himself from one computer to another in the same room. He chose the @ sign, @ to separate the username from the computer name in the address format, a convention that has persisted unchanged for over 50 years. Tomlinson later admitted he could not remember what the first email said, noting that it was probably something like QWERTY UIOPUN. He was testing whether the system worked. Today, an estimated 330 billion emails are sent every single day. Each one still uses the addressing format Tomlinson invented in that quiet room in 1971, with a username, an @ sign, and a domain name. The small technical choices made by individuals in obscure moments become sometimes the permanent furniture of the world. A quiet reflection before sleep. And so here we are, 100 facts, 3.3 million years of human ingenuity compressed into a few quiet hours together. We began in a place of dark and cold, where a creature that was almost but not quite human held a stone in both hands and struck it against another stone, and something sharp and purposeful fell away from the impact. And we have arrived at this moment, at you, warm and comfortable, perhaps half asleep, listening through a device that contains more computing power than the entire world possessed 50 years ago, connected through invisible signals to a global web of information that contains somewhere within it the digitized memory of almost everything humanity has ever made and thought and recorded.
There is something deeply calming about this long view, if you allow yourself to settle into it. Every tool, every machine, every network you have ever touched is the end of an unbroken chain that leads back to that first stone. The person who chipped the first hand axe and the engineer who laid the first fibre optic cable were engaged in the same fundamental act, looking at the world as it was and imagining how it might be different, better, more capable, more connected, more able to hold and transmit the hard-won knowledge of those who came before. Most of the people in this story had no idea what they were starting. The woman who first twisted plant fibres into rope did not know she was enabling every bridge ever built. The scribe who first pressed a wedge-shaped reed into clay did not know he was beginning a chain that would eventually lead to this script, to these words, to your ears. The medieval millwright who carved wooden gears to translate the power of falling water into the turning of a millstone did not know that he was working out principles that would, centuries later, live inside every mechanical clock and every automobile transmission.
Think about Hero of Alexandria, tinkering with his spinning steam sphere in the 1st century of the Common Era. He was working in a world of slaves and muscle power, a world that had no economic need for a machine that could do work without an animal or a person to drive it. He wrote down the principle and moved on to other curiosities.
He could not have known that 17 centuries later, a Scottish instrument maker named James Watt would essentially complete the thought Hero had started, would take that same basic idea of steam under pressure doing mechanical work and turn it into the engine that drove the Industrial Revolution. Hero's eolipile and Watt's steam engine are separated by over 16 centuries of history, and yet they are, in some sense, the same idea, finally given its proper moment in time. Or think about Michael Faraday, the blacksmith's son with almost no formal education, holding a coil of wire and a bar magnet in his hands in 1831 and watching a needle twitch. He did not know what he was looking at. He had no theory that told him what he was seeing. He only knew that something had happened that had not happened before, and he wrote it down with meticulous care because he understood, as all the great experimentalists have understood, that nature's surprises are its most important communications. What he was looking at was the principle that, within decades, would fill every city on Earth with electric light, and within a century would power every device in your home, and within 2 centuries would be the foundational technology of the civilization you were born into. All of it resting on the observation of a twitching needle.
That is the nature of technology. It is cumulative. It is patient. It accumulates not in straight lines, but in networks of influence and inspiration and accident, each innovation creating new possibilities that no one had anticipated, each new tool generating new problems that require new tools to solve. It is a story without a destination, because the destination keeps receding. Every generation looks back at the past as a place of astonishing ingenuity, and forward into a future that seems impossible. And there is something else worth sitting with here in the quiet of the night. Technology is almost never the work of a single genius working alone in isolation. It is almost always the work of many people, most of them unknown, most of them never credited, most of them solving small, specific problems that later turn out to be foundational to something much larger. The thousands of anonymous Roman engineers who calculated the slope of an aqueduct channel to a fraction of a degree. The generations of medieval glassmakers whose accumulated craft knowledge eventually made the precision optical glass of the telescope possible. The women who operated telephone switchboards for decades, learning the intimate geography of their communities through the medium of plug and cord and wire, and building in the process a practical understanding of large-scale communication networks that informed the design of everything that followed. Most of the history of technology is not the history of famous names. It is the history of unrecorded hands doing unrecorded work, mixing concrete by the shovelful, casting type by the tray, laying cable by the mile, writing code by the line. The famous names are the tips of very large icebergs of unacknowledged collaborative effort. Gutenberg could not have printed his Bible without the paper makers who made his paper, the ink makers who made his ink, the typecasters who made his metal letters, and the booksellers who sold his product.
Edison could not have lit New York without the workers who laid his underground cables, the glass-blowers who made his bulbs, and the coal-shovelers who fed his generators. Tim Berners-Lee could not have given us the World Wide Web without the decades of work by the ARPANET engineers, the protocol designers, the server administrators, and the programmers whose accumulated labour built the infrastructure he was building upon. Technology is a collective achievement. It belongs to our species. All of us, together, built this world from stone and fire and rope and clay and copper wire and silicon and light. And all of us, at the end of a long day, turn off the light and close our eyes and sleep, as all those makers did before us, in caves and castles and cottages and apartments, their minds releasing the day's problems and settling into the dark, their hands still for once, their bodies as ancient and as simple as they were 3,000,000 years ago.
What will the next 100 facts be? What will the history of technology section of a script like this look like in another 100 years? Some of what comes next is already being written in quantum computing laboratories and genetic engineering facilities and material science workshops in dozens of countries. Some of it is still sitting unnoticed in the corner of someone's mind, an idea that has not yet found its moment, waiting quietly for the right conversation, the right problem, the right hand to reach out and pick it up. For now, though, all of that can wait. The future can wait. History can wait. The only thing that matters in this moment is the slow rise and fall of your breath, the weight of your blanket, the warmth at the edges of your awareness as your body settles into the beginning of sleep. The stones are quiet, the fires are banked, the wheels are still, the signals have gone dark for the night. Rest now. A word before you drift away. If you have made it this far, through all 100 facts, from the first stone to the first email, then thank you. Genuinely, warmly, from the bottom of my heart, thank you. This is Hayo, boring history for sleep. And this channel has been something I have been quietly building for over a year now. As of today, we have around 200 subscribers, a small number, and I am proud of every single one of them. If this video helped you relax, if these slow histories made your mind feel a little lighter and your body a little heavier, please consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel. It takes 1 second, and it helps this small channel grow in ways that matter more than numbers. Leave a comment telling me where in the world you are listening from and what time it is on your clock. There is something genuinely beautiful about knowing that someone in Tokyo or Toronto or Cape Town or Copenhagen is drifting off to the same quiet story, the same slow march through the remarkable, improbable, endlessly fascinating history of human ingenuity. Sleep well. The world's long story will still be here when you wake up. Tonight,
You don't need to carry any of it. Let it all rest quietly in the dark. Good night.